Every buyer should receive a Seller's Property Disclosure Statement, SPDS. The revised AAR Residential Resale Real Estate Purchase Contract Form, the contract, recognizes the importance of the SPDS and provides Seller Property Disclosure Statement, SPDS. Seller shall deliver the SPDS to the buyer within 5 days after acceptance of the contract. Thus, pursuant to the contract, the seller is required to provide a SPDS in every transaction. Some sellers are reluctant to provide a SPDS. However, where a seller of real property knows of facts materially affecting the value of the property that are not readily observable and are not known to the buyer, the seller is under a duty to disclose those facts to the buyer. Hill v. Jones, 151, Ayres 81, 725, P. Tude, 1115, Apphorst 1986. Additionally, pursuant to the contract, the seller is obligated to disclose all known material latent defects that materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by the buyer. The SPDS will evidence the fact that the seller has made these required disclosures. Sometimes a seller will initially refuse to complete a SPDS on the basis that the seller has never occupied the property, or perhaps has never even seen the property. However, if the seller owns the property, the seller should be able to answer most of the questions in the Ownership and Property section of the SPDS. For example, even an institutional seller who has never seen the property can disclose the address of the property, disclose whether the property is located in an unincorporated area, identify the legal owner of the property, disclose whether the legal owner is a foreign person or non-resident alien pursuant to the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, indicate whether the property is in a community providing housing for older persons pursuant to the Fair Housing Laws, indicate whether the property is owner-occupied, lease, estate foreclosure, or vacant, indicate if the property is vacant and for how long, indicate if the property is rented and the expiration of the rental agreement, and disclose whether refundable deposits or prepaid rents are being held. Disclose whether the owner has entered into any agreement to transfer an interest in the property in any way. Additionally, most sellers know whether the property is in a homeowners association, HOA, and whether there are HOA fees. Arizona law mandates seller disclosure of these and other HOA issues in HOAs with less than 50 units. The seller may also be aware of assessments, litigation, or liens affecting the property. Most of the questions on the SPDS ask only for information of which the seller is aware. However, if there are questions on the SPDS for which the seller does not know the answers, the seller can simply use the explanation lines to explain. The fact that certain information is unknown by the seller and why can be important to the buyer. Despite the foregoing, some sellers still refuse to provide a SPDS. If a listing states that a SPDS is not available or will not be provided, a buyer's broker should nonetheless advise the buyer to request the SPDS in the offer. The seller can respond to the offer requesting a SPDS with a counteroffer that a SPDS will not be provided. However, before the buyer accepts the counteroffer indicating that a SPDS will not be provided, a buyer's broker should provide the buyer with a blank copy of the SPDS form, which will enable the buyer to make an informed decision regarding whether to waive the SPDS. In these circumstances, a buyer's broker would be wise to obtain the buyer's written acknowledgement of receipt of the blank form. A buyer should never waive a SPDS without seeing the SPDS form. Even a blank SPDS is valuable to the buyer. The buyer can and should utilize a blank SPDS as a checklist in conducting the desired inspections and investigations. The SPDS can prompt questions that will assist the buyer in evaluating the property. Clearly, the SPDS is a valuable tool for both buyers and sellers in a real property transaction. Therefore, every buyer should receive a SPDS. A simple solution to solar lease liability. Residential solar power is increasing in popularity and is an attractive option to many homeowners throughout Arizona. While realtors are often express concern about the potential liability associated with transactions involving leased solar systems, ensuring that a copy of the solar lease is attached to the residential seller's property disclosure statement, SPDS, can decrease the potential liability of all parties involved. Solar panels may boost a home's value, but leased solar systems can present challenges when an owner decides to sell their home. Among those challenges is a buyer's 1. Willingness to undertake an additional financial obligation. 2. Ability to assume the solar lease, presuming that the lease is even transferable. And 3. Understanding of the terms of the lease. To mitigate potential liability, disclosure and due diligence are needed. In order to satisfy their disclosure obligations, sellers must convey information to buyers regarding the solar system, including whether the system is leased and not owned. Likewise, in order to satisfy their own due diligence obligations, buyers are advised to learn as much information as possible about the solar system, including the terms of the solar lease and how it can be transferred. Unfortunately, in the event that the buyer or seller fails to meet their obligations, disputes often arise. Lines 181-189 of the SPDS address alternate power systems serving the property, including a leased solar system. Should the seller indicate on the SPDS that the property is served by a leased system of this nature, they are asked to provide the name and phone number of the leasing company and attach a copy of the lease. By following this directive, everyone in the transaction is better protected. In the event that the solar lease accompanies the SPDS, it would likely prove difficult for a buyer to successfully assert a non-disclosure claim against the seller or realtor's ER pertaining to this leased alternate power system. Similarly, receiving a copy of the solar lease would largely prohibit a buyer from claiming that information was withheld from them or that they lacked the pertinent facts needed to make an informed decision about purchasing the home and assuming the lease. While solar leases can present obstacles to a successful closing, attaching the solar lease to the SPDS is a simple solution to reduce liability, and it can make all the difference. A seller might not disclose certain things in the Arizona Seller's Property Disclosure Statement, SPDS, either accidentally, intentionally, or because disclosure is not legally required. Here are examples in each category. Common things a seller might not disclose, but should. These are material facts that should be disclosed under Arizona law: prior roof leaks or repairs, past water damage or mold issues, even if remediated, termite damage or treatment, non-permitted additions or renovations, neighborhood nuisances, e.g., noisy neighbors, barking dogs, flooding history or drainage issues, known plumbing or electrical problems, a death on the property if it affects the value. Even though generally not required, it must be disclosed if material. Things a seller is not required to disclose in Arizona, unless material: natural death, suicide, or felony on the property, ARS, Paragraph 32, 2156. Nearby sex offenders. Buyers must check public databases, HIV/AIDS, or other diseases in current or former occupants. Personal reasons for moving, unless they affect the property value. What happens if the seller fails to disclose? If a seller knowingly withholds material information, the buyer may cancel the contract, sue for damages after closing, file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate,